Hello and welcome once again to BYLC's Global Youth Climate Summit 2021. We have reached the third and final plenary for today's summit, and we'll be resuming it from tomorrow again. We are so happy to have you on board with us for our third session, and we're extremely excited to let you know all about what we have planned in this whole idea of plenary of what we will be discussing with our speakers. Our idea is to mobilize youth, build their leadership skills, and empower them to lead the fight against climate change. The Global Youth Climate Summit has brought together youth aged between 13 and 24 today to engage them in an intergenerational dialogue with leading experts in the field of climate change. This plenary is going to focus on the ways that youth can stand up to climate change and bring about effective measures to save the planet. To give you a brief overview of our panelists, I would like to start and welcome Risala Khan, who was born on the tumultuous edge of hope and fear. The birth of democracy in Bangladesh and the Bay of Bengal cyclone taking over 100,000 lives that forewarned the climate crisis. Today, he is a campaigner and advocate fighting for hope on the intertwining existential emergencies before us. From organizing for climate marches on the streets of New York to Madrid, campaigning for pressing global challenges from COVID-19 vaccine equity to corporate accountability, and standing with grassroots struggles for justice worldwide. Senior campaigner at the civic movement Abbas, graduate of Columbia University and Amherst College in Environmental Science and Policy, a BYLC alumni from 2009, a member of Global Shapers Community, and also an advisor at Donor Economics Action Lab. Risala has spoken on climate and environmental issues at Davos, CHOGM, and other global forums. Risala personally believes a hopeful and just future is possible, but the only way there is together. I would also like to welcome Marissa Sanders, who is a 24-year-old Sunrise Movement activist living in Overland Territory, Oakland, California. She graduated from Harvard in 2019, where she studied environmental science and public policy. She will be starting her PhD in climate science this fall at Scripps Institution of Oceanography, where she will continue studying the impacts of emergency climate interventions that propose using aerosols in the upper atmosphere to reflect sunlight. Outside of this work, Marissa is excited to continue organizing in her communities to fight for environmental, social, and racial justice. She envisions a future where today's youth radically reshape our society's relationship with the planet and with each other, building an equitable and irresistible future in which everyone thrives in caring, climate-resilient communities. I would also like to welcome Sechu Dolma, who founded Mountain Resiliency Project, a social enterprise dedicated to building resilient refugee communities through women's agribusiness with 15,000 farmers. That too, its proven record has been recognized by the Asia Society Young Leaders, Forbes 30 Under 30 in Social Entrepreneurship, and Royal Youth Award. Prior to this, she worked as a resource management consultant for UNDP in Latin America and SID as climate change strategist for the Terno-led Ministry of Commerce, Industry, and Environment. I would also like to mention about the slide which we're showing right now, who is Cemre, a Turkish environmental justice activist, double majoring in society and environment and political economy at the University of California, Berkeley. She is a part of Youth vs. Apocalypse Lead Circle and also coordinates her social media team and the statewide coalition campaign California Youth vs. Big Oil. She is an advocate for environmental justice, intersection analysis, sustainability, and collective liberation. Finally, it is my honor to introduce to you the moderator of the session, Rebecca Peters, who is a Queen Elizabeth II Academy Fellow at Chatham House of the Energy, Environment, and Resources Program, where her research contributes to climate policy and governance programs in the US, China, and the UK. She is also a final term PhD candidate, DPhil at the University of Oxford. With the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, Reach Water Security Program, she works closely with the government and academics in Bangladesh to address industrial water pollution. Previously, she has also worked and served as a Luce Scholar at the Asian International River Center in China. She has also worked with the Nature Conservancy and the World Bank. Rebecca, I now invite you to take over the virtual stage and begin the plenary on youth standing up to climate change. Rebecca, over to you.
Thank you so much, Roshni, and to BYLC for bringing us all together today for the Youth Climate Summit. And I'm absolutely thrilled to be hosting this panel with some really amazing young speakers on Youth Stand Up to Climate. The core themes of our session are vision, commitment, and action. And as it's been pointed out, our session is the third and last of the day for day one, following an inspiration opening panel and a science policy plenary. Tomorrow, you'll be focused on a solutions-oriented workshop. So we thought that today we would pose questions to our panelists that would be focused on their journeys in environment and climate action. I'll start by opening with some questions to them, and then we'll open up to audience questions before we close the session and the conference for the day. So with that, I would like to begin by turning first to Rissalat, and then we'll go down to Tsechu and to Marissa to ask why you got involved in environment and climate action. What were your formative influences, and what would you like to share about that experience to our audience today? Over to you, Rissalat. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, and it's really good to be here. Even though I'm not in a room with everyone and can't see everyone, it's a bit weird to join on Zoom, but it's altogether exciting as well because we have to burn less carbon to be here together from across the world. So firstly, what comes up for me in terms of why I got into this work is there was a lot of foundational influence from my parents. My dad kind of worked in, did a lot of environmental activism. So from my parents, I really gained an understanding of these issues at an early age that I was really grateful for. But one thing I wanted to share with you is a story, which is a story from about a decade ago when I visited the outskirts of Dhaka in this kind of small village community. And I was just walking around and I met this farmer. He was an old man who was on the field. And I asked him, I was like, Chacha, how's the climate changed over, your lifetime that you've seen in this land? And what he said to me and the look in his eyes, like that's something I will probably carry with me forever. He basically turned to me and said, Baba, Allah has taken his eyes off of us. He has turned his back on us. So for him, his story is that he used to be able to get a lot of yield in his farms, but as the climate has changed, now his family is facing deprivation. And for him, that manifests like a man who doesn't have the education or knowledge of what's happening with broader forces on climate. It manifests as a lack of agency that God has really deserted him and his family. And that's what I think of when I think of the injustice of climate change. And that's something that really fuels me. I think about that farmer and his family when I'm doing this work. And that's something that I would also encourage, people who are on this call, who are maybe listening in, think about what really fuels you and drives you, and think about what are those things that really get you, because that will be valuable fuel that will drive you and propel you forward.
Thank you so much, Rissalat. That was a fantastic way to get the conversation going. Tsechu, over to you.
Very similar to Rissalat's experience growing up. For me, my family was a huge influence. My community, so growing up in Nepal, climate change was a very much unavoidable part of our day-to-day life. So in terms of like working with the farmers, in terms of relying on your daily sustenance, a lot of that was changing when I was growing up in the 90s in Nepal. And on top of that, there was a lot of political turmoil going on at the same time with the civil war raging in the mountains. So for us, it was a lot of social and political insecurity that was also going hand in hand with climate change. And that was just exacerbating a lot of social issues such as access to education, access to proper health care, access to safety. And we could see that because of climate and political insecurity, all of that was showing up in the most vulnerable population. So I grew up in a migrant family, like Tibetan refugees, and we have a lot of that in Nepal. We have a lot of Tibetan refugees, we have a lot of Bhutanese refugees, we have a lot of people from oppressed castes. So a lot of that was showing up in my social reality, and it made it unavoidable um, to not work on strengthening like climate resiliency in my community. So yeah, I'm really excited that there's so many I can only see the number of participants, but I can also see the chat, and I saw there's a few folks from Pakistan, India, Nepal, Bangladesh, and I'm really excited to see that this is a regional issue in terms of climate. Well, it's a global issue, but for us in South Asia, being part of the Himalayan belt, it's a very much regional issue where a lot of us can collaborate and do very interdependent work. Turning it back to you, Rebecca.
Thank you so much, Teishu. That was interesting to hear the similarities with a family influence. And I'd love to hear from Marissa, if you might share with us your own formative influences.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for being here and for having me. These are great stories so far. So yeah, I came into the climate movement because it feels so much more powerful than anything that I could do as an individual to address the climate crisis, and also the deep social inequalities that are connected to both its causes and its impacts. So, you know, living in California, the realities of wildfire season becoming more intense and longer every single year, you know, kind of bringing smoke over to my area for months at a time are really scary, and you can see them getting worse each year. So my concern comes from that, and then also from a younger age, just kind of following the news about climate change and, you know, feeling really strongly about it. So I pursued science as a way to be able to work on solutions, kind of like renewable energy and sustainable agriculture. And, you know, next I'm pursuing my PhD in climate science. But since the climate crisis is so all-encompassing and just so deeply human, pure science never felt like it came close enough to addressing all the root issues the way that I feel like the Sunrise Movement and other youth social movements are doing really powerfully, by mobilizing people of all backgrounds and abilities to share their stories and to fight for justice in a movement together. So, you know, I think the young people in this movement all share sort of a deep sense of grief over the futures that we feel our generation has lost to the climate crisis. But at the same time, joining this movement to me is acknowledging and accepting that the world we may have once known, or that our parents thought they could promise us, is gone, and the one we've inherited is fundamentally different. So the only way to walk forward into a world of uncertainty is really to come together and imagine an irresistible future in which everybody can thrive, even on inevitably a warmer planet, and then kind of fight with everything we have to create that future together. Thanks.
Thank you, Marissa, for those powerful words. And what I think is interesting that's emerging across your answers certainly is this commitment and passion, certainly formative influences from where you grew up and how you grew up. And kind of building on that line of thinking, I'd love to hear how you've sustained your engagement over the course of setbacks and challenges. It's great to hear that each of you are bringing a very different perspective from kind of activism and campaigning, entrepreneurship, science, kind of bringing that perspective to bear on what you've done to continue going when you've hit setbacks, and how that might be useful for the people in the audience to hear from. Rissalat, to start with you, please.
Sure, and I see a comment about speaking potentially a little slower, so it's more accessible for everyone, and I will try my best. I think for me, two things come to mind. One is that I feel like whether I think about it on a daily basis or weekly or monthly, whatever cycle or rhythm, what Marissa was mentioning about the climate grief And that's very real, right? I think for me, it manifests as sort of like a dance between feeling hopeful, feeling possibility, and feeling the kind of fear and the stakes, and it's too big, and so on. And I think the first thing to say is that that's very natural. Most people I know that work in this field feel that way. It's important to create collective spaces where we can share those feelings, share those thoughts, and be there to support one another. So that's one thing that comes to mind. And the other thing that comes to mind is, when you think about the question of climate, it's, we throw around the term sustainability. But what does that mean? It basically means that, are we on a path that absolutely has an endpoint because we will run out of resources, we will, we are not on a sustainable trajectory, or is it something that can continue going and potentially be even regenerative? It can fuel us, it can kind of drive us forward, and it can sort of renew and replenish itself. And I think that sustainability idea can be applied to our personal lives as well. How do we operate as in regenerative ways? How do we do things that fuel us, that give us a lot of joy and in this collective work? And how do we do that so that it's not depleting us, it's not causing burnout, but actually we're coming together to have more fulfilling lives as a result of it. So I think that is an orientation that I personally find valuable.
Teju, it'd be great to hear what from your experiences you'd be able to share with our participants today.
Very much along the lines of Risala in terms of holding collective space and sharing the experience. Camaraderie has been one of the most like collaboration, camaraderie. Those have been my strongest source of wellness, I guess, in this whole space, and it's very encouraging. It's very encouraging when you see movements from communities from all around the world, and everyone is working towards a very similar goal in sustainability and resiliency. So it's very easy to get like bogged down with like all the doom and gloom, but there's a lot of small victories that I keep seeing from communities everywhere, and for me that is very, very important. Keeping ties in communities like apart from yours, and staying connected with positive news on action that's going on elsewhere. Yeah, really celebrating small victories are very important to me. And then, yeah, in terms of like personal wellness too, like sharing and like sharing with friends and like sharing with the groups of people is very important to me.
Thank you, Teju. Marissa, how do you respond to setbacks, and what kind of perspective might you like to share with our guests today?
Yeah, thanks. And I will try to talk more slowly. Thank you for asking that. So I think the best way to keep your head up through challenges and through work that can be really exhausting and discouraging is to invite people on the journey with you and find people to share it with you in a community. So I think this larger movement is, a lot of it is about building community through storytelling and making it clear that we really are all deeply connected to each other and to the planet that we live on. So not only do we pressure our political leaders to act on climate, but we're also showing how powerful it can be when youth rise up as a collective and radically inclusive force to challenge a status quo that, at least in the United States, has mostly valued individualism over community. So along the road to zero emissions, we while working to fundamentally uproot the power structures that kind of are shaped by colonialism and capitalism and racial and gender hierarchies. We're also showing up every day for each other in any and every way that we're able to. So to me, that means protesting, marching, striking, occupying, but also showing solidarity, writing, singing, gardening, creating, making art, dancing, and celebrating and uplifting one another with radical empathy, shared joy, and care. And so really it means working to unlearn the individualist and hierarchical ideals of success that our society kind of teaches us to strive for, and instead creating a world we want to live in through everyday acts of shared personal and collective revolution.
Thank you to our panelists for those wonderful reflections on recovering from setbacks. I'd like to turn now to a moderated Q&A with our really amazing attendees who are sending in some incredible questions that I think will spur even further discussion. We have a question from Kenneth Hans Gabriel Gabion, who wants to ask, as environmental activists or advocates, what can you say about the role of politics in the fight against climate change? And rather than calling on one of you, I might see if one of you might volunteer to pick that one up.
I can take this. I talked a little bit earlier about my experience growing up in the civil war in Nepal and how the political landscape with all the turmoil was really exacerbating the effects of like climate change. So like that was the 90s and the 2000s for us in Nepal. Like seeing the far end of what like political and civil unrest can really look like. And at that time, we were seeing a lot of like in terms of like in Nepal, we get really bad like flash floods during the monsoon. And then during the winter time, we have very cold spells where a lot of folks die from the cold. And then during the summertime, we have like really crazy epidemics of like malaria. So there's something for every season. And when there's something for every season, there is the government response is so important. And when there is a lack of government, where there's so much infighting inside the government, and the lack of political leadership, there was an absence of state in these in a lot of these communities. So the absence of state was there was no politician to call in terms of like helping make sure the proper relief measures were being delivered. So I felt like I really saw the far end of it in the 90s and the 2000s. But since we have a new government, a new constitution, a lot has changed in Nepal. And now the politicians are actively taking climate change as a big priority for the country. And it's also because the countries like Nepal are very reliant on the United Nations and international aid agencies to receive a lot of like foreign direct aid. So because of that, we can leverage these like multilateral political relationships to pressure our local politicians in Nepal to deliver more like climate resources. So I felt like in my life that I got to see the crazy absence of state all the way to today, where the state is actively doing a lot. And then like since I've been living in the U.S., yes, my representative in New York is it's AOC. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and like she's a congresswoman who's been pushing for the Green New Deal. And so in the US, I get the perspective of, yes, your representatives, you can pressure your local representatives to do a lot in terms of allocating resources within the government for the climate vulnerable populations. So yeah, I felt like I saw the whole spectrum, and I'm very encouraged that now in 2021, a lot more governments are going towards listening to community members about climate action.
Thank you.
I'd love to pick up on that, Rebecca, because I think this is a very fundamental question, if that's okay.
Yes, absolutely.
You know, I'm sure Marissa has a lot to say here. I just grabbed this book, which is Winning the Green New Deal. I don't know if it's showing up well. It looks white, but it's the book from the Sunrise Movement about the Green New Deal, which I think is a brilliant read, and I'm enjoying it. But I think I just want to take everyone back to exactly 1 year ago, which is March of 2020. You know, I had just gotten back from a trip, and you know, we had been hearing about the coronavirus, and then over the span of just 2, 3, 4 weeks, the world turned on its head upside down, right? I think we all experienced that, and that's a shared collective experience from the whole world. How did that happen? It happened because there was political will, there was political action, and governments actually, you know, the public also fueled that. The public really wanted safety, but the governments collectively came together and were able to turn entire economies on their head because they hold that power. We give them that power, you know, as people. I think, you know, as people, any government, even if it's an autocratic government, it needs support from people to continue to exist. And we've seen that throughout history. And now, you know, I know that the last session, you know, that the participants had was on climate science. I think the most important number that anyone should know is 7.6%. That's what the UN emissions gap report says is the amount of emissions that need to be cut every single year in order to stay on a 1.5 degrees Celsius pathway by 2030, which is the kind of safest limit that we have available to us right now. And if we think of what happened last year, even after all of that economic disruption, emissions came down by about 7%. Obviously, we do not want the kind of disruption that fuels these emission cuts, but it's important to note that that's the scale of change we are talking about year on year, because we have delayed for so long. And that's what we really need to drive towards. And the political levers are the only levers that can deliver that scale of change. So as young people in particular, we have that responsibility. It is unfortunate that we do, but we have the responsibility to really mobilize and make sure that our governments know that that is what they have to deliver for us.
Thank you so much, Rissalat. Marissa, would you like to add something, please?
Yeah, so I mean, politics are a huge topic when it comes to climate change, especially, well, I think largely in the United States. And we saw, you know, in the past 4 years, some really, really serious displays of political corruption. And we saw our democracy kind of teetering on the brink. And, you know, democracy, I think Greta Thunberg just recently said this in an interview, democracy is the most sacred institution that we have in fighting climate change and ensuring just and livable future for everyone in the future. So, or for everyone. So, you know, the Sunrise Movement is really all about mobilizing as many young people as possible to hold all of our politicians accountable to our demands that we address climate change and that we help people who are most vulnerable. So it was really youth voters and it was activists who got people registered, and that really tipped the balance to get Joe Biden elected. And so, but we were not complacent from there. You know, Joe Biden made promises to address climate change, but they were not strong enough. And so the Sunrise Movement continued pushing and is continuing to push, along with a lot of other youth justice movements, for continued action, for just more emissions cuts, more aid for the people who need it during the pandemic and in the face of climate disaster, and we're showing up everywhere we can to really keep the pressure on our leaders to deliver what the people need. So there's power in numbers. It's really hard to put that pressure on our leaders alone. And so the movement is doing that by mobilizing everyone. And then the movement is also, uplifting people to positions where they can run for office. So Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who championed the Green New Deal, is someone who the Sunrise Movement really supported. And now the movement is really trying to elect young people from its base to represent us and fight for what we really need politically.
Thank you for that. Picking up on that point, we have a question or kind of a comment posed from Diane Exconde about the root causes of climate change. And they point out corruption and money seem to be at the heart of a lot of this. And I'd like to invite our panelists to reflect on, when we talk about root causes, we often talk about combusting fossil fuels, but we also should think about political root causes. So Marissa's touched on elections and activism, but kind of picking up on this theme of the kind of the politics of climate change. What are some next steps for the people on this call who are wondering how to get involved and as activists? And anyone's welcome to jump in.
I can jump in quickly. And I love that question. I think that is a great framing of thinking about it. So climate science was, when did we learn that the greenhouse effect, causes global warming, that, causes problems and could be an existential threat? I wish this was an interactive session so I could see hands. But the answer is somewhere around the 1950s, 60s. So that's more than half a century ago. And the reason that we are here in 2021 is because of some of those root causes of corruption. And a lot of it has to do with the extremely powerful fossil fuel industry, which has run an extremely effective disinformation campaign for many decades, basically confusing people about what the science actually says, confusing people about what we need to do. So that has, been extremely beneficial for them in getting them billions of dollars that they have continued to generate while polluting the planet and putting us on this existential emergency. So in terms of thinking about what comes next, what has actually happened is that now everyone knows that climate is an emergency. Everyone knows that we need to take action. So the strategies have moved on. Because now what a lot of these, the worst actors are trying to do is try to convince you that there's no hope. They're trying to convince you that you should just give up and just go home and not think about this because it's too difficult and too hard. Or they might try to misdirect you and say, you should just do your own individual action. You should, just stop eating meat and just, buy an electric car or whatever. And that's it. Because those individual actions won't get us to actually hurting the industry's bottom line. So it's very important that we're aware of these kinds of shifts and that we know that that's what's coming. And what exactly Marissa said, what Sechu said about kind of building communities, building collective action, that's the path that we're gonna get the level of systemic change that we need very urgently this decade. And that's where young people have a fundamental role to play. And the audience members in this age range, like your peers, have driven forward this conversation over the last few years with the youth strikes movement across the world, millions of people mobilizing. And that's exactly the kind of thing that we need to continue and in order to get the change we need.
Thank you, Rissalat. Sechu or Marissa, would either of you like to offer a few reflections on that before we take our next question?
Yeah, I'd love to. So, scientifically, we know that the root cause of climate change is greenhouse gas emissions. But like you said, Rebecca, on a more social and political level, the climate crisis is really a result of decisions that have been made intentionally by people in power who did not value the health of our planet and of its people. And so now that the consequences of the climate crisis are falling most heavily on those who have contributed to that to the causes the least, it's these communities who are rising up and fighting for justice. And so that really means challenging the power structures that have allowed people in power to do things with no regard for their impacts on the planet or on other people. And so really in our everyday lives, the way we can challenge that is just by demonstrating radical care for ourselves, for one another, for the communities around us, and for the land that we live on. And so, on the one hand, that does lead to building a more sustainable energy system with fewer emissions, but that also means kind of, revisiting Indigenous land stewardship practices. It means, making community meals for people. It just means showing up for one another, and actually showing that you care. And that's kind of a simple everyday way that you can challenge those bigger political structures collectively.
Thank you, Marissa. Seichu, I'd love to start with you for our next question. I'm kind of pairing two together, one from Badro Munabar and one from Andy Jude, on how can one work from a village perspective to stop climate change, particularly at the local level for communities that may not have direct political influence or might be in a minority otherwise.
Yeah, from a village, from the village level, since 2012, I've been working in Nepal, mainly on a village level, in terms of building adaptation, like climate adaptation measures within our villages. So whether it is, like I was mentioning, like the floods during the monsoon, so building flood barriers for families to protect their farmlands or their houses during the monsoon, or whether it's building greenhouses so that you can protect your fields from like harsh climate and like erratic climate patterns, or whether it is like focusing on women's security, because we've seen like every time there's a climate disaster, the gender inequities only exacerbate. So putting in these safety measures within your communities, that's the work I've been doing since 2012. And for us, it can feel very, very distant, like our work in the mountains to the political players in Kathmandu feels very, very distant. Like it takes us sometimes like 5 days of walking and another 2 days of like road transportation, and then another few days of like mishap until you reach Kathmandu to get to your representative. So this distance is very far, but you can take a lot of measures within the community to safeguard the future, and also providing a lot of economic opportunities has been very important. Like helping communities, like supporting communities to find a future, like an economic future, and within the mountain communities has been very important for us. And then in terms of political action, yes, these have to go hand in hand. Like even if it takes 10 days to reach your representative, political action and like grassroots activity, they all have to go hand in hand. And so from the villages, yeah, I would say start with talking to we started with talking with our communities about what are our concerns about water insecurity, about education insecurity, about health insecurity. Talk to your community members in the village and talk about how we can develop collective action, whether it's through safeguarding our farms or whether it's through really putting the pressure in your capital, like through your representative on enacting like proper legislative measures um, to allocate resources. So I think all of these go hand in hand, but it really starts with the community and it starts with building a collective space.
Thank you very much for that. I'd love to turn to Risala to ask, we have a question from Bhumika who's asking about, how can youth have a role in reducing or eliminating climate injustice between developed countries and least developed countries? As a Bangladeshi who's now living and working in the US but works on global campaigns, it'd be really great to hear your perspective on this.
Thanks, Rebecca, and thanks for the question. In some ways, this is the question that brought me to my work, because previously I was working in Dhaka on some related climate issues. And I realized that a lot of the decisions that are being made that will ultimately determine that, what happens to people who have contributed the least to this crisis are being made at the geopolitical level. And that's what drew me to a career in international campaigning, where I do try to bug governments of the West in terms of upping their ambition, while I'm also doing some of that in Bangladesh as well when I get a chance. But I think right now what's really important to see is how with the technology that we have right now, like we are able to make connections across the world, right? If you look at the Fridays for Future movement, the youth strikes, millions of people have mobilized on the streets as part of that. But seeing those threads and connections from all across the world, that solidarity, that North-South dialogue has been really inspiring to me. And I've seen how people who may get more privileged platforms to voice their opinions have also, I'm seeing a shift where they're starting to realize that they have an opportunity and responsibility to be able to share those platforms and be able to also, share those opportunities, challenge actors such as in the media to say, like, why are you just paying attention to me, but not, these also other awesome actors that are, doing the same thing in other parts of the world. So there's a lot of that cross-pollination happening. And I think for anyone who wants to engage in that frame, I think there is enough opportunities to simply reach out, see who's doing something in your own community, but also see who's doing similar things across the world. Send a message, start a conversation, see what are those collaboration opportunities that are possible. And I see, Rebecca, will we have a time to sort of like wrap up? Because I see we're sort of coming to the end and I wanted to end with something. I'm not sure to do that now or a bit later.
I'm going to pose one question to Marissa, and then we'll do some brief kind of closing statements before I wrap up the day.
I'll leave that for them then.
Excellent. Thank you, Risala. So Marissa, I have kind of two questions I wanted to pair together. One from Tasnim Ahaman, who's asked to hear a little bit more about the role of science in solving the climate issue, and particularly kind of what kind of science is most necessary. And then from Lujian Romosi, who's asked, would you consider environmental science as a good career for people who are both interested in politics and in science for the kinds of problems we face with today's environmental issues? Thank you. Over to you, Marissa.
Yeah, thank you so much for the great questions. So I really think science has so many roles to play in finding solutions to climate change. There's kind of no limit to how you can apply an interest in science in any way to climate solutions. So that means you could study renewable energy technology. It means you could study adaptation or study the climate system, the oceans, the soils, study ways to make agriculture more sustainable. There are just so many paths to apply science to create a better future. And so it's really hard for me to come up with an answer for what is the most important, because I even also think that social and political science is just as important as natural and physical science. So I really think that anyone who's interested in addressing the climate crisis through a science lens should really just find what excites you the most and find a way to do that the best you can in a way that, you know, energizes you the most, that you're the most excited about, and do what you're good at, because that's how, you know, you'll make your biggest contribution to the movement. And so on that second question, is environmental science a good career choice? I think absolutely, especially if it's what you want to do. But I think if you're interested in other things, if you're interested in art, if you're interested in film, if you're interested in writing, you should really do what you're best at and what you love the most, and find a way to apply that to help your community, to help the people around you, and maybe apply it to sustainability and environmental practices, but really just do kind of what you love the most and do it your best. And that's how you'll contribute the most to the movement.
Thank you, Marissa. Those are powerful words for our guests to be thinking about. I'd like to invite Rissalot and Marissa, if you have any kind of closing words that you'd like to share briefly. Over to you, Rissalot.
Sure. So firstly, this was a great discussion. Really honored to be here with all of you. And Marissa and Sechu, it's been great to hear from both panelists and Rebecca as well. Thanks for that. I guess the one thing I would close with is sort of what I was saying before, which is that right now is, you know, we talked about this decade being the window where we need to do this. Otherwise we lose and we, you know, potentially don't have a safe planet to live in. And there are impacts already happening and they will continue to happen, but because they happen on a delayed timeline, the consequential decision that will decide what our world looks like for much of our life are happening now. And there's a particular role that I would say is happening right now, as in this year. So I hope that you will take this as a call to action, which is that right now, you know, governments all over the world are thinking about what does economic recovery from COVID-19 look like. They're spending enormous amounts of money into these various priorities, but a lot of it has gone into upholding the current system of energy based on fossil fuels, you know, and basically extractive industries. But at the same time, if you just look at what all the experts are saying, all the scientists are saying, they're saying this is the, you know, there's a lot of, you know, horrifying impacts from COVID, but this is also an opportunity to invest that money wisely, to really invest it in renewable energy infrastructure, to, you know, conserve landscapes and forests and generate jobs in that way that can also have great economic benefits, but to do it right. And that's the window that we cannot miss this year, because once we do, you know, who's going to pay for all of that investment that is needed to transition our systems of energy, food, etc. So the two things I will say at the very closing is, one, there's a stat that really gets me, which is that for every unit or dollar of GDP, there's $3 or 3 units of debt. So, you know, debt, which is basically money that is borrowed against the future, which is money borrowed against young people, that's the money that's being used to invest. So sometimes young people don't have a voice in political decision making, but I want you to feel that this is your money being invested because it's, you know, being borrowed against your future. So I want you to really feel that. And secondly, I'll end with a quote by the late John Lewis, the US congressman, who was in his early 20s when he was in the civil rights struggle fighting for freedom. And he has always said to get into good trouble, right? To really cause some sort of, you know, to challenge decisions, to make sure that they go the right ways and to get into good trouble. And this is a year that we really need good trouble. And you are all people that can help contribute to that and help hold that. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Rissalat. I'm so sorry to say that we must part ways for the day because we are just over time actually now. Thank you so much to Tsechu, Marissa, Rissalat for joining us. Thank you to BYLC. Thank you to our amazing attendees. I'm so sorry we couldn't get to all of your amazing and very thought-provoking questions, but I do hope to see you tomorrow at the workshop where you'll have an opportunity to develop your own vision and think about the goals that you want to work toward. With that, I will hand back to BYLC to sign us off for the evening. And thank you so much again to Rissalat, Marissa, and Tsechu for your really thoughtful words and wisdom.